What if the next global crisis didn't begin with a nuclear launch or a massive ground invasion, but with a narrow stretch of water that most people couldn't even find on a map? For decades, military analysts have focused on missiles, aircraft carriers, and advanced fighter jets as the symbols of modern power. Yet some believe the most consequential strategic asset in the Middle East isn't a weapon at all. It's a shipping lane, a corridor only a few dozen kilometers wide at its narrowest point, yet one that carries a significant share of the world's seaborne oil trade. If that corridor were ever seriously disrupted, the consequences could extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. Energy markets could react within hours. Insurance costs for commercial shipping might surge. Supply chains across Europe and Asia could face renewed pressure. And governments around the world would suddenly find themselves responding to a crisis that began far from their own borders. This isn't simply a story about Iran or the United States. It's a story about how geography can become strategy, and how a single maritime choke point could influence military planning, energy security, and global economics all at the same time. Because in the 21st century, wars are no longer measured only by the territory armies can capture. Increasingly, they are measured by the infrastructure they can protect, the trade routes they can influence, and the uncertainty they can create. Imagine a period of rapidly rising tensions. Diplomatic negotiations begin to stall. Military deployments increase across the region. Commercial satellites detect unusual naval activity. Energy traders start watching every movement in the Gulf. News headlines speculate about what might happen next. None of these developments necessarily mean conflict is inevitable, but history shows that perception alone can influence markets long before the first shot is fired. Sometimes the expectation of disruption becomes almost as powerful as disruption itself. That is one reason the Strait of Hormuz has remained one of the world's most closely monitored waterways for decades. Its importance has never been defined solely by geography. It is defined by dependence. Countries separated by thousands of kilometers rely on energy passing through this corridor every day. Manufacturing centers in Asia, industrial economies in Europe, global shipping companies, commodity markets, financial institutions. Each has a stake in keeping this route open, which means any instability in the region immediately becomes an international concern. Military planners understand this dynamic well. Control does not always require complete domination. Sometimes the ability to introduce uncertainty is enough. If commercial shipping companies begin rerouting vessels, if insurers raise premiums, if naval escorts become necessary, the economic consequences can accumulate even without a prolonged military confrontation. This illustrates an important principle of modern strategy. Influence is not always measured by destruction. It can also be measured by disruption. The possibility that vital trade could be interrupted may force governments to make decisions they otherwise would not have considered. And in today's interconnected economy, those decisions rarely remain confined to one region. They ripple outward, across markets, across alliances, across entire supply chains. Now imagine how such a scenario might reshape military planning. The United States has maintained a significant naval presence in the region for decades, not simply to respond to conflict, but to preserve freedom of navigation and reassure regional partners. Any indication that commercial shipping could face elevated risks would likely trigger decreased surveillance, intelligence sharing, and coordination among allied naval forces. Not necessarily because war had begun, but because preventing escalation often requires visible preparation. Deterrence depends as much on credibility as it does on capability. The more uncertainty grows, the more every deployment sends a message. A destroyer entering the region, an aerial surveillance mission, additional reconnaissance flights. None of these actions automatically signal that conflict is imminent. Yet together they shape expectations, and expectations can influence the behavior of every actor involved. On the other side, regional military planners would also be calculating their options. Modern deterrence is no longer based solely on conventional firepower. It increasingly includes unmanned systems and T-chip capabilities, electronic warfare, cyber operations, and information campaigns. The objective is not always to defeat a stronger opponent outright. Sometimes it is to complicate that opponent's planning, to increase operational costs, to create uncertainty, to force difficult choices. That approach has become increasingly common in contemporary military strategy. Success is often measured not only by what happens on the battlefield, but by how effectively a nation shapes its adversary's decisions before the battle even begins. And that may be the most important lesson hidden beneath this entire scenario, because the real contest may not begin when missiles are launched. It may begin much earlier, inside intelligence assessments, inside financial markets, inside naval command centers, and inside the calculations of leaders trying to determine whether deterrence is still holding or whether the balance has begun to shift. In the next chapter, we'll explore why one narrow waterway has become one of the most strategically significant locations on Earth, and why military planners often believe that controlling uncertainty can be just as powerful as controlling territory. At first glance, the Strait of Hormuz doesn't appear extraordinary. It is a relatively narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. There are no massive mountain ranges guarding its entrance. No sprawling military fortresses dominating the horizon. To an ordinary observer, it looks like just another busy shipping lane. But appearances can be deceptive. Military planners rarely judge geography by its size. They judge it by its influence. And few places on Earth influence the global economy as profoundly as this narrow stretch of water. Every day, a substantial portion of the world's seaborne crude oil and liquefied natural gas moves through this corridor before reaching markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Tankers carrying energy supplies for countries thousands of kilometers away must pass through the same confined route. If traffic slows, the effects can travel far beyond the Middle East. That is why this waterway has remained one of the world's most strategically sensitive maritime choke points for decades. Many people assume energy security begins at oil fields. In reality, it often depends just as much on transportation. Producing energy is only the first step. It must then be loaded, shipped, insured, protected, and delivered. Every stage creates another point of vulnerability. A modern economy does not simply require oil. It requires confidence that oil will continue arriving tomorrow. When uncertainty enters that equation, markets often react long before any physical shortage appears. Investors reassess risk. Shipping companies review their routes. Insurance providers adjust premiums. Governments begin discussing contingency plans. Sometimes these reactions occur within hours, even if no military engagement has taken place. This is one of the defining characteristics of modern strategic competition. Economic expectations can shift faster than military deployments. Imagine receiving intelligence suggesting that tensions in the Gulf are increasing. No missiles have been launched. No ports have been closed. No formal blockade has been announced. Yet naval patrols increase. Reconnaissance aircraft become more active. Commercial satellites detect unusual maritime movements. Immediately, analysts begin asking a different question. Not whether conflict has already begun, but whether the probability of conflict has increased. That distinction matters, because markets rarely wait for certainty. They respond to changing expectations. In today's interconnected world, perception itself can become a strategic force. This is where geography intersects with military doctrine. The narrower a shipping route becomes, the fewer alternatives exist. Unlike highways on land, maritime choke points cannot simply be expanded overnight. There are no convenient detours capable of replacing them at the same scale. If commercial vessels are forced to reroute around longer paths, transportation costs increase. Transit times grow. Fuel consumption rises. Supply schedules become less predictable. None of these effects individually create a global crisis. Together, however, they can place sustained pressure on international trade. This explains why major naval powers continue investing heavily in maritime security. Protecting sea lanes is not solely about military prestige. It is about preserving the stability upon which global commerce depends. For decades, military strategists have described this approach as protecting the global commons. The idea is straightforward. Certain routes, communication systems, and international waterways are so important that disruptions affect far more than the countries directly involved. When those systems remain stable, international trade functions more efficiently. When uncertainty grows, the consequences spread outward. One regional dispute can quickly become an international economic concern. That is precisely why events in the Gulf are monitored not only by defense ministries, but also by energy companies, financial institutions, logistics firms, and shipping operators. Each interprets the same developments through a different lens. Military planners assess operational risk. Energy traders evaluate supply. Investors monitor volatility. Governments calculate diplomatic responses. The same event generates multiple layers of consequence. Technology has made this environment even more complex. Commercial satellites now provide imagery that once belonged almost exclusively to governments. Automatic identification system data allows analysts to monitor shipping patterns in near real time. Open-source intelligence communities examine aircraft movements, naval deployments, and infrastructure activity with remarkable speed. Information moves globally within minutes. That increased transparency creates new opportunities. It also creates new challenges. A single satellite image can trigger international speculation. An unusual naval deployment may produce headlines around the world before governments issue official statements. In modern crises, information often travels faster than policy. Managing perception has therefore become almost as important as managing military operations themselves. This is also why naval presence carries symbolic value beyond combat capability. A destroyer on patrol does more than strengthen military readiness. It signals commitment. A surveillance aircraft communicates vigilance. Joint naval exercises demonstrate cooperation among allies. These activities are designed not only to prepare for potential contingencies, but also to influence calculations before any confrontation occurs. Deterrence at its core is psychological. Its objective is to convince potential adversaries that escalation would carry unacceptable costs. When deterrence functions effectively, the most significant victory is often the conflict that never begins. Yet deterrence is never static. Every new technology changes the equation. Long-range drones expand surveillance. Precision-guided missiles increase operational reach. Electronic warfare can disrupt communications. Cyber capabilities create additional avenues for competition. Artificial intelligence accelerates intelligence analysis and decision support. Each innovation alters how military planners evaluate both opportunity and risk. As these capabilities evolve, so does the strategic importance of locations like the Strait of Hormuz. It is no longer simply a shipping lane. It has become a testing ground for the future of maritime security. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this scenario lies elsewhere. The greatest strategic influence may not come from closing the waterway. It may come from convincing the world that closure is possible. Because uncertainty has become a resource in its own right. The possibility of disruption can alter investment decisions, influence insurance markets, change military deployments, encourage diplomatic negotiations, without a single shot being fired. And that realization leads to an even bigger question. If geography provides the stage, and technology provides the tools, what ultimately determines whether a regional crisis remains contained or expands into a confrontation with global consequences? The answer may lie not in ships or missiles alone, but in the decisions made by political leaders long before military commanders receive their orders. In the next chapter, we'll examine how military technology, economic pressure, and geopolitical signaling intersect, and why the first battle in a modern conflict may take place in financial markets and command centers before it ever reaches the battlefield. For much of the 20th century, wars followed a familiar pattern. Political tensions rose, armies mobilized, borders hardened. Eventually, the first shots were fired, signaling that diplomacy had failed. Today, that sequence is becoming far less predictable. In many modern confrontations, the first battlefield is no longer physical. It emerges in cyberspace, financial markets, intelligence networks, and information campaigns long before conventional forces are ordered into action. By the time missiles appear on television screens, an invisible contest may already have been underway for weeks or even months. That transformation is redefining how military planners think about conflict. Victory is no longer determined solely by who possesses the most advanced weapons. It increasingly depends on who can shape the environment before fighting begins. Scenario in which tensions around the Gulf continue rising. Commercial satellites detect increased naval activity. Reconnaissance aircraft expand their patrol patterns. Governments issue updated travel advisories. Shipping companies quietly review contingency routes. None of these developments necessarily indicate that war is imminent. Yet together, they begin changing behavior. Energy traders factor additional risk into pricing models. Insurance firms reassess maritime exposure. Financial institutions monitor commodity markets more closely. Military headquarters increase intelligence coordination. No bombs have fallen. No ports have been attacked. Yet the strategic environment has already begun to shift. This illustrates one of the defining characteristics of 21st century competition. The perception of instability can generate consequences before instability itself becomes reality. Technology has accelerated this process dramatically. A generation ago, governments controlled much of the information available during international crises. Today, commercial satellite constellations capture images multiple times a day. Independent analysts compare those images with shipping data, aviation activity, and publicly available intelligence. Within hours, obsolete across global media and social platforms. This unprecedented transparency offers important advantages. It also compresses decision-making timelines. Political leaders may have less time to evaluate events before markets react. Military commanders may face greater public scrutiny. Diplomatic messages can be interpreted around the world almost instantly. Information has become both a strategic asset and a strategic vulnerability. The side that manages information effectively may gain valuable time. The side that loses control of the narrative may find itself reacting instead of shaping events. The same evolution is transforming military technology. Unmanned systems continue extending operational reach. Artificial intelligence assists analysts in processing vast quantities of reconnaissance data. Electronic warfare can interfere with communications, navigation signals, and battlefield coordination. Cyber operations target digital infrastructure that supports government services, transportation, finance, and logistics. None of these capabilities necessarily replace conventional military power. Instead, they multiply its effectiveness. Modern warfare increasingly resembles an interconnected system rather than a collection of isolated weapons. Every sensor supports another platform. Every communication link enables another decision. Every logistics network sustains another operation. Disrupt one element, and the effects can cascade across the entire system. This interconnected nature explains why resilience has become one of the most valuable strategic advantages. Military strength is no longer measured only by offensive capability. It is also measured by the ability to absorb disruption and continue operating. Can communication networks remain functional under pressure? Can supply chains recover quickly? Can critical infrastructure adapt after an unexpected interruption? Can decision-makers continue receiving accurate information despite electronic interference? These questions receive increasing attention inside defense ministries around the world, because future conflicts may reward endurance as much as firepower. Economic resilience is equally important. Energy markets provide a clear example. If uncertainty surrounding a major shipping route grows, governments often begin preparing long before physical shortages emerge. Strategic petroleum reserves may receive greater attention. Alternative suppliers become more valuable. Shipping companies diversify logistics options. Manufacturers review inventory levels. Financial markets adjust expectations. Each individual decision may appear minor. Collectively, they reshape the global economy. Modern deterrence therefore extends well beyond military deployments. It also includes maintaining confidence that trade, finance, and essential resources will continue flowing despite geopolitical tension. This is where strategic signaling becomes especially significant. Not every military exercise is preparing for war. Not every deployment indicates imminent confrontation. Often these actions communicate resolve, reassure allies, or discourage potential escalation. Deterrence functions through perception. Its effectiveness depends not only on capability, but also on credibility. If a government believes its commitments will be honored, the likelihood of miscalculation may decrease. If uncertainty surrounds those commitments, the risk of unintended escalation can increase. Maintaining that balance is one of the most difficult challenges in international security. Every public statement, every naval deployment, every diplomatic meeting, every intelligence assessment, each contributes to a much larger conversation occurring between governments long before any formal conflict begins. This broader perspective also explains why military planners rarely examine a single event in isolation. A drone flight may appear routine. A naval patrol may seem ordinary. An infrastructure project may attract little public attention. Yet viewed together, these developments often reveal broader strategic trends. Defense analysts frequently focus less on individual headlines and more on long-term patterns. How rapidly are technologies evolving? How resilient are supply chains? Which alliances are strengthening? Where is infrastructure expanding? Which regions are attracting greater military investment? Answering these questions often provides more valuable insight than reacting to a single day's news cycle. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this entire scenario. The future of warfare may not be defined by one decisive battle. It may instead be shaped by countless decisions made long before any confrontation becomes visible. Investment in technology, protection of infrastructure, energy diversification, industrial capacity, alliance coordination, information security. These quiet preparations rarely dominate headlines, yet they often determine which nations are better positioned when crises emerge. Because by the time the world recognizes that a conflict has begun, the most important strategic advantages may already have been established. And that leads us to one final question. If tomorrow's conflicts are increasingly decided before the first shot is fired, what exactly will victory look like in the decades ahead? In the final chapter, we'll bring all of these pieces together, exploring why the future of global power may depend less on who can wage war, and more on who can prevent one while maintaining strategic advantage. For generations, military strength was measured by what the world could see. The number of tanks rolling across a border, the size of an air force, the reach of a navy, the destructive power of missiles. Those indicators still matter, but they are no longer the complete picture. The strategic competition unfolding today is increasingly defined by something less visible and potentially far more consequential. The ability to preserve stability while maintaining credible deterrence. That may sound like a contradiction. In reality, it has become one of the central challenges facing every major military power. Imagine two rival nations confronting each other across a strategically vital region. Both possess advanced weapons. Both understand the devastating cost of open conflict. Neither wants to appear weak. Yet neither can ignore the economic consequences of escalation. Every military decision now carries multiple layers of risk. A naval deployment sends a political signal. An air patrol reassures allies while simultaneously attracting international attention. A military exercise demonstrates readiness, but may also increase tensions if interpreted differently by another government. This is why modern strategy is often less about seeking confrontation and more about managing perception. The objective is not simply to project strength. It is to project strength without accidentally triggering the very crisis that strength was intended to prevent. That balancing act has become increasingly difficult because technology is compressing decision-making timelines. Artificial intelligence is accelerating intelligence analysis. Commercial satellites are making military movements visible almost in real time. Cyber operations can unfold within seconds. Financial markets react almost instantly to geopolitical headlines. Information no longer waits for governments to issue official statements. It spreads globally within minutes. As a result, leaders often find themselves making critical decisions under intense pressure and with incomplete information. History has shown that miscalculation, not necessarily deliberate aggression, has often been one of the greatest drivers of international conflict. Reducing the risk of miscalculation may therefore become just as important as strengthening military capability itself. This is why resilience has emerged as one of the defining concepts of modern national security. A resilient nation is not simply one that can fight effectively. It is one that can continue functioning despite disruption. Can energy continue flowing if one supply route is interrupted? Can communications remain operational under cyber pressure? Can logistics adapt if transportation networks change? Can industries increase production during prolonged crises? Can governments coordinate quickly with allies? These questions extend far beyond the battlefield. They determine how long a nation can sustain strategic competition without exhausting its resources. The Strait of Hormuz illustrates this principle better than almost any location on Earth. Its importance is not limited to the ships passing through it. It represents a broader lesson about interconnected systems. Energy supports industry. Industry supports military production. Shipping supports energy exports. Financial markets support investment. Digital infrastructure connects every layer together. None of these systems operate independently. Pressure applied to one often affects all the others. That is why modern security cannot be understood through military analysis alone. Economics, technology, diplomacy, industrial capacity, and energy policy have become inseparable components of national power. The battlefield no longer ends at the shoreline. It extends into ports, factories, data centers, financial institutions, and global supply chains. This transformation is influencing military doctrine around the world. Countries are investing not only in advanced weapons but also in satellite networks, cyber custody, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, resilient infrastructure, and diversified energy supplies. The objective is no longer simply to build a stronger military. It is to build a stronger national system. Because future conflicts may not reward the country with the largest arsenal. They may reward the country capable of adapting faster than its competitors. Adaptability is becoming a strategic advantage. Innovation is becoming a form of deterrence. Resilience is becoming a measure of power. Perhaps that explains why so many governments are paying close attention to developments in strategically important regions, even when no major battles are taking place. Military planners are rarely watching only the present. They are studying patterns. Which technologies are changing operational planning? Which economic pressures influence strategic decisions? Which alliances are becoming stronger? Which vulnerabilities remain unresolved? Every regional crisis becomes a laboratory for understanding future competition. The lessons learned today may shape defense planning for decades. So, what does this entire scenario really tell us? It suggests that the future of conflict may depend less on overwhelming force and more on strategic balance. The most successful nations may not be those that seek confrontation. They may be those that combine military strength with technological innovation, economic resilience, diplomatic coordination, and the ability to maintain stability under pressure. Because preventing conflict can sometimes require just as much preparation as fighting one. And perhaps that is the biggest misconception surrounding modern geopolitics. People often ask which country has the fastest missile, the largest navy, or the most advanced fighter aircraft. Those remain important questions. But another question may prove even more significant. Which nation can protect its infrastructure, secure its energy, sustain its economy, defend its information networks, and adapt faster than every competitor when the international environment suddenly changes? The answer to that question may determine not only the outcome of future wars, but whether those wars happen at all. If this scenario demonstrates anything, it is that the world's most strategically important assets are not always the most visible. Sometimes they are shipping lanes that quietly sustained global commerce. Sometimes they are communication networks connecting military commands. Sometimes they are energy corridors that power entire economies. And sometimes they are the decisions made behind closed doors long before the world realizes that history is beginning to change. Because in the 21st century, power is no longer defined solely by the weapons a nation possesses. It is increasingly defined by the systems it can protect, the partnerships it can sustain, and the resilience it can build before the next crisis arrives. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the next major global confrontation is shaped less by missiles and more by infrastructure, technology, and economic resilience, are governments around the world preparing for the war they expect or the one that's actually coming? If you enjoyed this deep dive into military technology, geopolitics, and the hidden forces shaping global security, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to explore more scenario-based documentaries examining the future of warfare and strategic competition, be sure to subscribe. Because the biggest battles of tomorrow may begin long before the first shot is ever fired.